This is now episode 3 of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. Our tagline with respect to the Osteopathic Lyceum is where knowledge and skills grow together. The aim here is to continue on a little bit from the last topic, which was the importance or the value of faith, or the importance or value of believing in something that you cannot currently observe or sense, right? So that there is something that exists that you're curious about or you're trying to identify that you cannot currently identify, you cannot currently sense. So that's quite repetitive, saying it very similar way. But the point is that if you don't believe that something can occur, then you probably won't explore it or try to identify it or observe it or anything like that. So that does have value. Now, there's some problems with that in that those things that you take on faith, you take to be valid or you take to have value, that maybe don't have the value that you ascribe to them, such as knowledge that somebody else has shared from you from a previous point of view or a previous observation. If it isn't what it says it is, then you're building your understanding on something that isn't what it says it is or isn't valid. So just to touch on the other aspect of faith, it's essentially having a high degree of confidence or having confidence in something that is not you, or something that is told to you by something that is not you, or shared with you, something along those lines. So the knowledge base in osteopathy has some very interesting challenges, and we'll discuss this from different angles as we go along. But the angle that I want to discuss this from is essentially mechanistic claims, or the claims from specifically cranial and visceral osteopathy. Now, I'm going to lean heavily into 2 systematic reviews, and I'll tell you what a systematic review is, so there's some understanding there, instead of just saying, look, science, right? Or look, a published paper, because there's a lot of published papers in research journals of varying quality, the journals having varying qualities, being good, bad, indifferent, terrible, predatory, things of that nature. But just because something's published doesn't mean it has the value that you would think it has. There are things that are published in places for political reasons, and sometimes those political reasons can include career advancement. So you won't immediately see that if you don't know what you're looking at. So I want to at least spend some time identifying the pros and cons of the particular research I'm going to lean into, just to attempt to identify the problems with the osteopathic knowledge base, or the base of knowledge within the osteopathic profession. So for those listening only on audio, I'm going to share my screen. For those listening or that can see this, you'll be able to obviously identify what the heck is on the screen. So what I'm going to do first is tell you what a systematic review is. So the place that I'm going to have or draw information from for the point of this discussion is it's really kind of a methods paper, sort of. It's not a complete methods paper, it's just a methods overview. It's entitled Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses, Lindsay S. Uman. Hopefully I said that appropriately. Maybe I mispronounced the name. It's from the Journal of Canadian Academic Child Adolescent Psychiatry, 2011, whatever. The Journal of the Canadian Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So the point here isn't the journal that it's from. It's essentially that it's a methods paper. So systematic reviews, very, very basically. So as I scroll through this, for those who can see the video, you may pick up on some of this. And if you are watching on video, I would say pause if you're curious, or look this up for yourself, whether you're on video or you're listening to audio. So the whole idea of a systematic review, so we've got a line here: systematic reviews, as the name implies, typically involve a detailed and comprehensive plan and search strategy derived a priori with the goal of reducing bias by identifying, appraising, and synthesizing all relevant studies on a particular topic. Okay, so first, a priori is a term that means that which can be known without sensing, more or less. So you know this, you don't have to look for it, you just know it. That can be a problem. So if your a priori assumptions have a flaw, everything you build will have that flaw built into it, or all knowledge that you build with that a priori assumption will have the flaw in it, which is quite common. It's more common than is often discussed. So We got a priori out of the way. The idea of detailed, comprehensive plan and strategy that you've already developed with the goal of reducing bias by identifying, appraising, synthesizing all relevant studies on a particular topic. So the concept of a particular topic means that you have to have a particular topic you're trying to know something about. So you're going to actually have to narrowly define a topic, right? So you have to build a very narrow frame. Otherwise, there's this huge amount of papers, most of which will be absolute junk and not pertain to what you're looking for, that will show up in your search when you go and search varying medical databases or research databases. You'll find a bunch of junk, and then somebody's got to look through that and sift out the junk. So one of the ways that you narrow that down is you've got your general topic, so you define it very clearly. That's your frame. Then what you need is inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you need to say, if a paper has this, we will include it. If a paper does not have this, whatever this is, we exclude it. So we throw it out. Right. So very simply, a systematic review is a very organized search of literature on a very narrow topic that you've already predefined, and you set criteria for papers you'll use and set criteria for papers you will not use, because you have to narrow it down. Otherwise, there's this huge amount. Now, subsequent to finding those papers, what you're going to do is use varying tools to assess the quality of the paper. So there's tools to assess the high likelihood of bias in the paper. There's tools to essentially, there's statistical tools to be able to take the data, the reported data in whatever form it is, and synthesize it, bring it together, and then do a statistical analysis on that. So you can, if you're looking, say, in the osteopathic world, at inter-rater reliability, so do different raters or do different practitioners find the same thing? There's statistical ways to figure out if that's consistent in all studies or if it's inconsistent, right? So it's all over the place. That's a really kind of big overview of it. So that kind of grounds what a systematic review is. The steps are outlined here that you would generally take, but again, there's a set of steps. You have your predefined topic, your narrowly defined topic, that's your frame. You have your inclusion, exclusion criteria. Then what you do is you grab the data, you find ways to statistically synthesize it and evaluate it. You have tools to figure out whether or not the studies were of high quality, whether or not they were likely to be biased. So that's just your general overview that grounds our ability to then talk about the particular studies I want to lean into here. So the first one, is this the first one? It's got to be 2016, because one was 2016, one was 2017. It's the same author group. So the first one is the reliability of diagnosis and clinical efficacy of cranial osteopathy, a systematic review. So now we know that it's a systematic review. We kind of have a flavor of what a systematic review should do. And then when we look at the abstract, we'll actually get most of the information we need from the abstract here. Now, the authors, Albin Guillard, Nelly Darbois, Richard Monvoisin, Nicolas Pinceau. So my French not being of any high quality, hopefully I didn't mess that up too much. Their names anyways. The objective. So this is kind of where you see their frame. So if we look at their objectives in this paper, to identify and critically evaluate the scientific literature dealing with reliability of diagnosis and clinical efficacy of techniques and therapeutic strategies used in cranial osteopathy. So you see a bunch of words there, but that's a very tight narrowing of what they're looking for with respect to any research paper that would say anything about cranial osteopathy. So if it says cranial osteopathy, it's not good enough. It's got to have some degree of looking at reliability of diagnosis. So is there a consistent range of outcomes when these diagnostic methods are used? The clinical efficacy. So is there some measure of change pre and post treatment and the therapeutic strategies, right? So you need to know about the diagnostic side. Is there a consistent set of findings within diagnostics within a practitioner or between practitioners? And then is there a pre and post change when cranial methods are used, right? So the methods, we'll go through this really quickly. Relevant keywords were used to search a bunch of databases, yada, yada, yada. Searches were conducted up to June 2016 with no date restriction as to when the studies were completed. As a complementary approach, we explore the bibliography of included articles and consulted available previous reviews dealing with this topic. So they found other systematic reviews or possibly narrative reviews, but they found other reviews about the reliability and efficacy of cranial osteopathy. Right. So now we look at their exclusion criteria. So now we know what they're looking for. Now we need to know what they set as their criteria for including or excluding. So regarding diagnostic processes in cranial osteopathy, we analyze studies that compare the results obtained by at least 2 examiners or by the same examiner on at least 2 occasions. So what you have here is at least some admission that many of the research papers that are published probably have very, very small numbers of practitioners involved. So the paper needs to have at least 2 separate examiners, or 1 examiner that it looked at least 2 separate patients, or maybe the same patient at least twice, right? So you're looking at kind of bottom of the barrel sample sizes here. So your statistical power is likely to be low. So the ability to make generalizable claims off of what seems to be the case within the research on cranial osteopathy is likely very low, because they set their criteria so low for the amount of participants. Right. For efficacy studies, only randomized controlled trials or crossover studies were eligible. So they needed a pre and post, and they needed kind of a control group, or a group that did not get what would be considered cranial treatment, and a group that did, or a group that didn't get it one time and then did get it the other time. That's your crossover study, more or less. Excluded articles that were not in English or French. So if there was an article in Italian, they didn't use it. If there was an article in German, they didn't use it. They just used English or French, right? And then they further restricted their search by saying only articles where the full text version was not openly available. What? Yeah. Wait, how did that go? And for which the full text version was not openly available. Okay, yeah, there we go. That is how that's said. So the sentence structure is just a little funky when you're going through and breaking it down. But if an article was not publicly available for free, they didn't use it. So which means there may be articles that have a higher quality of evidence that they were not able to access because maybe they didn't have institutional access. They didn't have the ability to get behind the paywalls on a lot of the journals. So they could only use the ones that were free and publicly available. So that becomes a limit to their data collection, because there may be other studies that are available that are of high quality that might change their findings, but because it was part of their exclusion criteria, it's not there, right? So you just, while I agree with the general methods of the study, this is just kind of a sidebar, and I generally agree with the outcomes and the findings, it's possible, we want to leave open the possibility that maybe there's some studies that are available that they didn't include that can change the outcomes based on the methods that they used. All right, the study selection, blah, 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 that's kind of no big deal. So this is where you get to see this portion where it says search results. This portion lets you know how many articles you would find with a very, very narrow search, which is why it becomes important to have your exclusion criteria. So it says in our electronic search, we found 1,280 references concerning reliability of diagnosis studies, plus 4 references by our complementary strategies. Based on the title, 18 articles were selected for analysis, right? So you had to go from 1,280 down to 18. That's a lot of work. And depending on your author group and depending on the time that they have and who's assigned what, that's annoying, right? So you just see that you have a very, very small amount of articles, right, from a very large amount, where it says, now we look at the efficacy. Regarding efficacy, we extract 556 references from the database plus 14 references through our complementary strategy based on the title. 46 articles were selected, 32 articles were not retained on the grounds of our exclusion criteria. So they threw out a bunch of stuff. So there's a lot of work here. 1280 plus 556, what's that, 13, or geez. Like almost 1,800 articles total, if not 1,900-ish. My really, really rough math probably isn't that good, but that's a lot of studies to come down to a very small amount. Data extraction analysis. So what were they looking at? Risk of bias and reliability studies was assessed using a modified version of the quality appraisal tool for studies of diagnostic reliability. Methodological quality of the efficacy studies was assessed using Cochrane risk of bias tool. 2 screeners conducted these analyses. So they were essentially member checking. When you have more than one person check, the point of that is to reduce the likelihood of mistakes and the likelihood of bias. The results here for reliability studies, our analysis leads us to conclude that the diagnostic procedures used in cranial osteopathy are unreliable in many ways. That doesn't mean what you think it means colloquially. That means that the range of results when using the diagnostic procedures is not consistent. It is unstable. So you don't get the same range of results consistently, and it also doesn't have a discriminatory ability. It doesn't discriminate between that which is ideal and that which is not ideal. That's what that means. It doesn't mean, you can't, it does mean you can't trust it because, so that's a colloquial side. It does mean you can't trust it, but specifically, technically, it means that you don't get a similar range of results with consistency. For efficacy studies, the Cochrane risk of bias tool shows that 2 studies had a high risk of bias, 9 were rated as having major doubt regarding risk of bias, and 3 had a low risk of bias. And the 3 studies with a low risk of bias, alternative interpretations of the results, such as a non-specific effect for treatment, were not considered. So what that's saying, with the ones that probably didn't have a bunch of bias in them, they didn't consider alternate explanations of their findings, which likely means that they had a preference for the interpretation of their findings, which would also suggest that if there is a possible alternative explanation of their findings, they wouldn't explore it, which means that is a way of using bias or maybe employing bias, right? Really, I would say preference, employing the preference for the explanation that they like, right? Conclusion, our results demonstrate consistently with those of previous reviews that methodologically strong evidence on the reliability of diagnostic procedures and efficacy of techniques and therapeutic strategies in cranial osteopathy is almost non-existent, right? So with this methodology, with the papers that they included and the papers that they excluded, with the fact that they only used freely available public or full text articles, they have a bit of a problem in their method that there might be articles that would be of a higher quality that could shift their results a little bit. I would say it's probably not likely based on what I've encountered with respect to cranial osteopathic research, but it's at least possible. So there is a flaw in their method because of what they searched. Now, it's not a fatal flaw, and it is argued for in a reasonable way, so you don't get too mad at it, but there's at least the possibility to be entertained that there are studies that exist that would change the outcome here or the view on it. Now, what I'm going to do is just flip over again for those not those that can't see this. You can look this up. For those who can see this, you can also look this up. You can pause it. You can do whatever you like. But the same author group did essentially the same systematic review methodology for visceral osteopathy. So the title is Reliability of Diagnosis and Clinical Efficacy of Visceral Osteopathy, a Systematic Review. Again, Albin Guillard, Nelly Darbois, Richard Monvoisin, Nicolas Pinceau. So again, hopefully I'm not butchering their names because I am not a French speaker. But your methods are almost exactly the same, right? They give you the list of databases they searched. They say that they only inter-rater reliability studies, including at least 2 raters for the intra-rater, or the intra-rater reliability studies, including at least 2 assessments by the same rater were included. This again says that the sample sizes that they're looking at are likely on the very low side, which again impacts the ability with the available research published in the osteopathic world, especially on visceral osteopathy, that the sample sizes are probably really low. There's probably a decent amount of papers that only have 1 rater on 1 patient. So case studies, or, maybe 2 raters on 1 patient. These are very small sample sizes. It doesn't mean there's no signal there. It just means it's likely statistically underpowered, and it's not generalizable. So you might actually randomly run into a freak event that looks awesome. And then if you take that to underpin your decisions, you're probably not going to run into that freak event often. You're probably going to run into the normal range of results or the reliable range of results much more often. And then you could then make the claim that the person involved in the study was magic or awesome or the best. But realistically, it was just a freak event that got recorded randomly, right? The blah, 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 blah. Where are we? Only for efficacy studies, only randomized controlled trials or crossover studies on healthy subjects, any condition, duration, outcome. So again, you're looking at essentially the exact same methods that we discussed with the previous one for cranial. Very similar thing as far as they probably had a gigantic amount of papers come back in their search. Then they get down to 8 reliability studies and 6 efficacy studies were included. The analysis of reliability studies showed the diagnostic techniques used in visceral osteopathy are unreliable. Again, you have to remember that what that means is that they do not give a consistent range of results, and they do not discriminate between what would be maybe healthy or unhealthy, or an organ that's doing what it's supposed to do and an organ that's not doing what it's supposed to do. So it's not good at that. The methods that are used are not good at determining those things, especially based on claims. Regarding efficacy studies, the least biased study shows no significant difference for the main outcome. The main risk of bias found in the included studies were due to the absence of the blinding of the examiners and unsuitable statistical method or an absence of primary study outcome. So this is just bad research with respect to what they included for the visceral paper. Their conclusion is the results of the systematic review lead us to conclude that well-conducted and sound evidence on the reliability and the efficacy of techniques in visceral osteopathy is absent. Now, so I'll get rid of the screen here. Does that immediately mean that either cranial or visceral osteopathy are useless, unreliable, have no clinical efficacy? It doesn't mean that. What they've done is they have examined the available research, and from the available research, their conclusions are likely quite sound. You have to accept their inclusion and exclusion criteria and how narrow their question was, which means that it doesn't necessarily say that clinical or cranial osteopathy and visceral osteopathy are useless, have no reliability, and that they have no clinical efficacy. Right now, the efficacy is a weird term because efficacy primarily means in the context of research, where effectiveness means outside of the context of research. So a medication can have high efficacy in a research setting and low effectiveness out in the general population. And one of the problems is that people are highly variable. So just keep that in mind. So again, these pieces of research do not say explicitly that cranial osteopathy and visceral osteopathy suck. They say that the research cannot support the claims made by either of those two divisions of the osteopathic profession. And that may be the case more because of the research methods, not because of the actual impact of those methods in the clinical setting. So here's where we get to an interesting spot. Practitioners will often swear by certain methodologies because they have what they believe to be success with them. So depending on how the practitioner is observing the patient or the type of information they're taking in from the patient, they may be able to see a very stable range of results. They may see a positive outcome in the direction that they're observing and measuring quite often. So the practitioner is seeing what they're seeing, but it doesn't mean that it's working, their method is working the way they think it's working or the way they attempt to explain it as working. It just means that they see a consistent, stable range of results, right? But what you observe and how you interpret it are not always exactly what's happening. So you have to be careful with that. The other thing is that with respect to osteopathic treatment, depending on where you are or who you are as a practitioner, you have a highly sorted group of patients who will approach you for treatment. You do not have a normal representation as a range of the population at large in your practice. You have a very, very highly self-sorted group. So if you have a particular thing that you become well known for, you're more likely to have patients who are concerned about that thing for whatever reason that they're concerned about it, as opposed to just anybody randomly walking off the street. You'd have a greater understanding by accident of what osteopathy does if your patient population was highly random and was not self-sorted, just people who were literally walking off the street because they were curious. And even that is a self-sorting mechanism. But if you're just walking down the street and you looked at somebody and you gave an osteopathic treatment, and you looked at somebody else and you gave them an osteopathic treatment, that would give you a greater understanding of what osteopathy does in the population at large by accident. The problem we all have as practitioners is that our patients sort themselves before they come into our office for varying reasons. One of those reasons happens to be you as a practitioner are well known for something, or you make claims in the general public sphere that you're good at something, so you attract those people. Some may not necessarily be well known for something and have a slightly more random or wide-ranging group of the population, but they're self-sorted by the fact that they believe personally that they have an issue that you might be able to help with, or that they have a high degree of hope that you can help with, right? So there's a selection problem for what we as practitioners observe because of that sorting mechanism. So to return to the general point or the initial point, the research base of osteopathy is not high quality. It is not high quality in sample size. It is not high quality in its methodology writ large. Now, there's many osteopathic studies that are high quality, that do have a decent sample size, that are very methodologically sound. That does exist, right? So to say that there's nothing there would be very kind of very dishonest of me. But to say writ large, osteopathic research is not high quality is relatively fair, right? So there's ways that we can do that better. But also as practitioners, to recognize that if we're basing our interpretations of what we're seeing as a relatively stable phenomenon within our patient population on the explanations that are provided from research or previous knowledge sources, we have a problem, right? We have a problem as a profession that our knowledge sources are not necessarily high quality. They can improve. So my hope here, as I go through this, journey of figuring out how to share information with you and maybe develop some form of back and forth or some form of narrative thread through this process, my aim is to share with you the ability to appraise on some level that information and to hopefully impart some knowledge that you can improve your own skills for evaluating the knowledge or generating the knowledge. Maybe you become some form of clinical researcher. Like, that would be really interesting. Some of you will be interested, some of you will not be, some of you are very busy, some of you have other things that are higher on your priority list. That's all fine, but somebody out there will find this interesting enough that it'll spark them. Maybe they'll go and seek further training. Maybe they'll become self-trained. Maybe we can collaborate in some way, shape, or form. But I really aim to do something about improving the knowledge base of osteopathy and having the profession writ large have a better understanding of knowledge claims. So a way that I'll do that is, as we go through, I'll talk about things like the philosophy of science and epistemology, ontology, and axiology, things of that nature, so that you understand that and where the osteopathic profession seems to sit within those terms and how that impacts how we view our profession, how we view the world, how we view science as an entity, which it really isn't an entity. It's a set of steps or a method for investigation and essentially the generation of knowledge, but how that might be playing out. And I'm almost always probably making some kind of mistake, so I freely accept that. And maybe I'll talk about why I say that at some point with respect to the research that I've already done with respect to my thesis. So we can definitely touch on all those. But for now, I'll go ahead and sign off, and hopefully that was helpful.